Chloe would be glad that Violet was coming to live with her. Violet could go to school in New York, and Mother could devote all her time to Stephen. And Father would be positively glad Violet was gone. Mother might worry what the neighbors would think, but Father probably wouldn't even care about that. They'd both be glad. They'd gotten rid of Chloe, and now... Violet felt a tear trickle itchily down the side of her nose, and she wiped it away with her sleeve. Tickets! The conductor was coming through the car. Violet nervously held out her ticket, trying to look like she rode on trains all the time. The conductor read the ticket and frowned at her. Kind of young to be going to New York City alone, aren't you, miss? I'm almost 12, said Violet defensively. The conductor shrugged, punched a hole in the ticket, and handed it back to her. At the next stop, a woman got on and took the seat across from Violet. Violet could tell at once that she was a meddlesome woman. She was dressed in the fashion of 20 years ago in a sweeping black bombazine gown, and she smelled of mothballs. She was tightly corseted into a perfect S shape with a pigeon bosom, a wasp waist, and a bustle to exaggerate her rear end. On her head, she wore a black hat with an enormous lopsided brim, 2 feet to starboard and 1.5 feet to port, Father would have said. The corpse of a large bird, dyed a dismal purple, was diving into a mass of black ribbons heaped around the crown of the hat. Involuntarily, Violet clutched at her own neat straw hat, as if the woman might try to trade with her. The woman sat down stiffly and with great difficulty. She tilted her head back slightly, probably to balance her hat, and scowled down her nose at Violet. I, she said with great emphasis, am Mrs. Albert Renwick of Huntington, Long Island. Pleased to meet you, Violet lied. Mother probably would have wanted Violet to stand up and curtsy. And you? Said Mrs. Renwick. Miss Violet Mayhew of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, Violet said. Mrs. Renwick twitched her nose suspiciously, as if she thought Violet might be making fun of her. You're very small to be traveling alone. Where are you going? New York City, said Violet, thinking it was none of Mrs. Renwick's business. And what takes you there, if I may ask? I'm going to visit my sister, my grown-up sister. Young ladies, said Mrs. Renwick, should not travel unaccompanied on the train. Is your sister married? No, said Violet shortly. Then why is she not living with your parents? Are your parents still living? Yes, said Violet, but they're very busy with my brother Stephen. He's still recovering from the war. Violet hoped that would silence Mrs. Renwick. A recovering war veteran was a very impressive thing to have in the family. All the more reason your sister ought to have stayed home to help. In my day, a girl's greatest joy was being of service to her brothers. I myself worked my fingers to the bone in a glove factory to pay my brother's tuition at Harvard, and I felt privileged to do so, Mrs. Renwick said defiantly, as if Violet had suggested she hadn't. Privileged to do so. But I suppose your sister is one of those new women. She made it sound like a disease. Violet glanced around surreptitiously for another empty seat. It would be very rude to get up and walk away from Mrs. Renwick, but Mrs. Renwick was pretty rude herself. Mrs. Renwick seemed to sense what was on Violet's mind and changed the subject. I am dying, you know, Violet, she said. Violet stared at her. She felt bad for thinking uncharitable thoughts of Mrs. Renwick. I'm sorry. Too kind, Mrs. Renwick murmured. What of? Said Violet, and then realized that this was an extremely rude question. Mrs. Renwick didn't seem to think so. Have you heard of tuberculosis? Yes, said Violet, regretting she'd been rude. She added, I'm sorry you have tuberculosis, Mrs. Renwick. I do not have tuberculosis, said Mrs. Renwick. Violet stared again. But I thought you said... Those foolish doctors don't know what I have, said Mrs. Renwick with proud finality. Oh, said Violet. Dozens of doctors have seen me, and none of them can say what is the matter with me, not one. Maybe nothing's the matter with you, Violet ventured. Excuse me, are you a doctor? Asked Mrs. Renwick coldly. Of course not, said Violet, irritated. I should think not, said Mrs. Renwick. It's a revolting thing for a female to do, becoming a doctor. Absolutely revolting. Since this was what Father had always said, and Mother had, as always, agreed with him, Violet figured that was what most people thought. She had never wanted to be a doctor herself. She'd never really thought about being anything. She had known what was in her future, the hope chest, and the marriage, and that was it. But Chloe had wanted to be a nurse, and Flossie, before she died in the influenza, had wanted to be a reporter, and some of Flossie would always be in her. Violet remembered that from Chloe's letter. That was why Violet found herself answering, "I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be a reporter." Mrs. Renwick gaped. A reporter, said Violet, like Nellie Bly. She filed news from the trenches in Europe, during the war. Somehow Violet felt that she had to say this to Mrs. Renwick for Flossie's sake. "How absolutely appalling," said Mrs. Renwick, rolling her eyes upward and fluttering her eyelashes at the same time, which had the disconcerting effect of making her eyes go all white. "A female in the trenches!" "There were plenty of females in the trenches," Violet said. "At the end, the Germans were sending in women and boys 14 years old, and the Russians—" "A young lady does not need to know anything about trenches," Mrs. Renwick interrupted firmly, "nor about Germans and Russians. Let us change the subject. Where does your sister live?" Violet felt instantly dejected. She didn't know where Chloe lived. The return address on the envelope was 265 Henry Street, New York City, but she had no idea where that was. She had a vague idea that New York was bigger than Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. This part of her plan was not figured out too well. Mrs. Renwick was watching her closely. "I'm not sure exactly where," said Violet. "Ah, well, she's meeting you at the station anyway," Mrs. Renwick said. And having settled Violet's travel arrangements to her satisfaction, she went back to the main problem. "Violet, a female can't be a reporter, and that's final." Violet didn't know what to say. She knew it was very wrong to contradict adults, and she didn't even really want to be a reporter. That had been Flossie's dream. Chloe had always told her that a girl could be anything she wanted to be. So had Violet's 6th grade teacher, Miss Elliott. But Violet had certainly never heard that from anyone else, so she bit back any response. She turned and looked out the window at a smoke-blackened brick factory, its hundreds of window panes too grimy to see through. "I'm glad you've decided to see reason," said Mrs. Renwick. "I'm an old woman and a dying woman to boot, and my words are worth hearing. A woman can't be anything she wants to be, because that's not the way the good Lord made us. He made us to be the helpmeets of men and to be protected by them. If women go out being doctors and reporters and demanding to vote, then how can they expect men to protect them anymore?" Violet hadn't said anything about voting. Getting the right to vote was Chloe's project. Father had said that it was sending Chloe off to college that had filled her head with damnful crazy ideas. But Violet knew that Chloe's head had been filled with crazy ideas before. Violet didn't much care about voting. She was only 11, and nobody was talking about giving 11-year-olds the vote. Mrs. Renwick went on. "The Lord has given females the wonderful gift of being able to bear children, and that's the work that women do. So let's hear no more of this nonsense about wanting to be a reporter. Now, how many children do you want to have, Violet?" Violet felt deflated. She flopped back on the prickly green train seat, even though she could hear Mother in her head scolding that a lady doesn't ever let her back touch the back of her chair. There was no point in arguing with Mrs. Renwick, even less point than there had ever been in arguing with Mother or Father. What Mrs. Renwick was saying was the same thing that Violet had heard again and again for as long as she could remember. 7, Violet said. People were always asking her how many children she wanted, just as they asked boys what they wanted to be when they grew up. She had learned that 7 was a very impressive answer. Certainly it impressed Mrs. Renwick. 7? Gracious, that's quite a lot, my dear. Violet managed to smile. Mother had always told her, "Smile even if it breaks your face." "Well, that's a much better idea than being a reporter. 7? My, aren't you an ambitious little chick?" Mrs. Renwick leaned forward creakily to pinch Violet's cheek, which Violet submitted to despite an overwhelming smell of mothballs. "Here," Mrs. Renwick waved to the candy butcher, who was coming down the aisle with his box-shaped tray strapped to his belly. "A Tootsie Roll for the young lady, please. No, make it 2 Tootsie Rolls." The man gave Violet the candy and accepted a nickel from Mrs. Renwick. "Anything for yourself, ma'am?" "Oh, no, not for me." Mrs. Renwick's enthusiasm waned suddenly, and she did the thing with her eyelids again. Violet looked hastily away. "I'm not, well, you know." dying, in fact. But the candy butcher hadn't listened past no and was off down the aisle again, calling, "Candy!" Violet bit into a Tootsie Roll and let the burned chocolate taste run over her tongue. She looked at the dying Mrs. Renwick, whom she had politely thanked, of course, and thought that if growing up meant having 7 children and wearing a dead bird on her head, Violet would rather have been born a boy.
Okay, so we are finished with listening to Chapter 2. So now what I want you to do, I want you to look at our picture here, and we have heard the word trenches in the text. So I want you to just study the picture for a second here. We have a soldier and we have a news reporter. Okay, from this image, what do you think the trenches were in the war they were describing? Remember in the story they were talking about the trenches? What do you think the trenches were? They are holes dug into the ground where soldiers hide from the enemy there. They hid in the trenches to hide from the enemy. Okay, what do you think the man is doing, and why do you think that? What do you think he's doing? Let's look a little closer at the soldier there. What do you think he is doing? And why do you think that? He is looking out of the trench preparing for the enemy. Okay, look at the soldier's face. What do you think life was like in the trenches? Let's go back and look at the soldier's face. Do you see the face there? What does it look like to you?